Hello and welcome to Development Futures, a podcast brought to you by the Indo-Pacific Development Centre here at the Lowy Institute. Coming to you from Gadigal land, my name is Roland Rajah and I'm the director of the centre and your host for today's episode. In this episode, we are talking about the trade and economic policies of US President Donald Trump and how the rest of the world, including Australia, should respond. Trump has repeatedly said that his favourite word is tariffs, and he said it many times as he has not only threatened tariffs on literally every country in the world, but also imposed on-again, off-again tariffs in a chaotic display that has left American firms, the stock market, its consumers, and indeed the rest of the world in a tailspin. It's quite frankly a confusing mess. Thankfully, joining me on today's podcast is one of Australia's best economists, Dr. Jenny Gordon. Jenny is a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute and an honorary professor at the Australian National University. Jenny, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Roland. Lovely to be here.
Trump and tariffs. Let me reel off a very brief summary of what Trump has done so far for our listeners. First, he's already done a very big tariff hit by imposing 20% additional tariffs on all Chinese imports. Second, he's been doing on-again, off-again tariffs of 25% on Canada and Mexico, with the latest being that the tariffs are being imposed, but only where this doesn't fall under the rules of their regional free trade agreement, which means most Canadian and Mexican imports are not being hit, but some are. Third, Trump has imposed 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminium imports, which notably has directly hit Australia, despite our government's hopes to get an exemption, which is an issue we'll come back to specifically. And then finally, the big one, which is expected for early April, is the so-called reciprocal tariffs, which Trump says will be applied to all countries, depending not only on what tariffs they impose on the United States, but also any other regulations or policies that the Trump administration thinks unfairly affects the US. And then plus there's a bunch of other tariff-related things going on, including lots of different tariff threats, but those are the main tariff initiatives. So Jenny, what do you make of the Trump administration? What is it trying to achieve with all of this? And does it make any sense?
Well, I think there's some different camps in the Trump administration. And so you can take the sort of the Peter Navarro camp that thinks that tariffs are a great idea, that you use them largely as industry policy to bring production onshore. So you actually encourage domestic producers to expand, you make it more expensive for imports, and you'll get the import replacement game, create jobs, and you'll go back to some kind of rose-coloured glasses view of what the 1950s were like with manufacturing and the rest of it. So I think that's one sort of view and one motivation is to bring jobs onshore. But Trump also talks about the fact that tariffs are the magic wand to mean he doesn't really have to cut spending in places that are hard to cut, like Social Security and Medicare, and he can cut taxes at the same time. So not just continue the previous Trump tax cuts, but also add new tax cuts, most of which benefit the wealthy, partly because the middle class in the US don't actually pay a lot of taxes. So the only place left for tax cuts are probably more the wealthy than the middle class. So you can't have both. And I've described this as bonkers, right? So you're either going to raise a heck of a lot of revenue, or you're going to bring a lot of production onshore and pretty much isolate the US economy. Now, if you think you can continue to sort of raise revenue, balance your budget through tariff revenue, and then also correct your trade deficit, which is the other big concern that they have. Well, first of all, that presupposes that it's basically a huge tax on the American consumer. So it's actually taxing the middle class. So you're paying for that, getting rid of your trade deficit by taxing the middle class. And that way you can kind of expand tax cuts to the rich. So that's sort of challenging from the American perspective. But they've got this rhetoric around the fact that, well, foreigners will pay the tax. And to some degree, the US is a very large market, so it has some market power. If you really want to sell into that market, you probably will reduce prices a little bit. But the way that can often happen when the taxes are targeted at a country in general, like with China, is for the Chinese renminbi to depreciate. It means that poor old Chinese producers are getting less than they were getting before. So there's different ways to try to achieve that and share some of the pain. But the US consumer will pay most of the tax ultimately. And the Peterson Institute have done a bunch of calculations, and their estimates are around about $2,000 US per household per year from Trump tariffs 1. And so what is this going to do in Trump tariff 2? The numbers are quite significant.
One of the things I wanted to draw you on, Jenny, was just the way in which Trump is actually imposing these tariffs as well seems extra problematic. One, unlike Trump's first trade war with China in his first term, which went over 1 year period, went from 0 to an extra 20% effectively average rate of tariff increase on China. This time, he's gone straight to 20% almost in terms of tariffs on China, talking about tariffs on everyone. And this on-again, off-again thing is creating a huge amount of uncertainty. So it just seems like this time, it's not just more damaging, it seems massively more damaging than the first time around.
It's partly because the third sort of category, right? So we've got the revenue raisers, we've got the isolationists, grow American industry policy types. And then you've got this other one, which is, I just want a big stick to clobber people with. And so Trump's on again, off again, what can I threaten countries with? And to date, countries have actually given very little in terms of concessions. So Canada kind of made noises to get that they would stop their, what it was, something like 44 kilos of fentanyl, which had grown by 2,000% according to the White House press secretary, but it was still only 44 kilos. It had been even smaller the year before. They made noises that got them over that kind of that first hump, but then he keeps it then again because he needs the continual hit. So he needs the country saying, President Trump, can you do this for us, please? We'll do this for you if you exempt us. The pressure on the Albanese government to get a concession. First of all, I didn't think we were going to get one because the 25% tariff on steel and aluminium is at least the one consistent policy he's had that he's placed on everybody rather than this stop-start, you get one tariff and you get a different tariff type of thing. It was much more that is industry policy and that is security related to boost production of iron and steel or aluminium and steel in the United States. So that one probably was more along those lines. But the others, the on again, off again, and this set that he's planning now, if you're raising revenue, the most efficient way to raise revenue is a uniform tariff on everything, not differential across different countries. If you really want to play an optimal tariff game and try and extract as much rent out of the foreign producers as possible, you'd only put tariffs on the things where you had the most market power so that they'd have to sell it to you and they'd have to reduce their costs because they couldn't sell it anywhere else. But that's not what he's doing. This is a very strange use of, I think in his head there's some sort of strategic benefit, but I think it's just that he really likes the announceable. Look, I've got this country to do this for us and I've got this country to do this for us. And he needs that kind of continual attention, whether that's deliberate in a flood the zone, tie up journalists, distract foreign countries so that they're so busy worrying about what tariffs might be coming down their way. And boy, has it worked for Australia, that they're not looking at the broader consequences of these sets of policies. So they're not looking at the impact of the freezing the funds for USAID. And the fact that those funds, even where they said they've restored them, the money's not hit the ground. And so people aren't getting their retrovirals. Tariffs is almost like a big noise chaff balloon that everybody's so busy looking at that they're ignoring what's actually going on with the deregulation. It's not even a deregulation agenda. They're just removing staff and removing agencies. The impost on Australian universities of getting a letter from any US university collaborator saying, we need you to guarantee that none of the collaborations that you're doing with the US that get any US funding have any diversity, equity, inclusion component to them, or any engagement with China, though we've already been through that a little ourselves. So these sorts of things are happening in the background. And what they're doing is fundamentally changing the role of the US in the way it engages in international organizations, on international agreements, in international relationships. The tariffs are the headline, but there's so much else coming that is actually really worrying, I think.
I mean, I think we want to get to that here, but I think it is true what you said, that the tariffs, they're very potent as a distraction in many ways. And here you mentioned, Australia, we were hoping to get the exemption from the steel and aluminium tariffs, which is something that we got last time when Trump introduced basically the same tariffs in his first term. We got an exemption that time. This time, all the expectation was that maybe we could get it, and then we didn't. And it really, from my observation, I think it struck a nerve here We were really hoping that we would get it, and then it didn't come through, and that seemed to send a real message. Why do you think it struck a nerve here in Australia so much? We don't export that much steel and aluminium to the United States. So why do you think it's such a potent weapon in that regard?
We're a bit vulnerable in our steel and aluminium industry, partly because we've had so many industry rescue plans that we're probably a little vulnerable to the accusation that we are actually subsidising those industries in ways that would merit another country saying unfair competition. But of course, China has not exactly been quiet in subsidising some of their steel and the like. Our exports actually to the United States didn't really change much when we got that tariff exemption last time. So it wasn't as though we got a competitive advantage and could expand our exports into the US market because others were facing the tariff. We've got BlueScope steel that's quite significant. I suspect part of the exemption last time might have been more around that investment strategy and the fact that BlueScope were importing components from Australia into US production. So it could have been something to do with that. This time, less potent argument. You have Lucknick got a bee in his bonnet about Australia's aluminium rescue packages as being dumping aluminium on the US market. So he had a different set of people there. So I think there's sort of a range of things, but I think they also got hammered last time round when they gave Australia a concession. And then every other country said, well, why aren't you giving us concessions too? We've been nice to you as well. And this is a really interesting point this time round. There's a bit of a theory that the US wants to go for red, green and yellow countries. So if you're a red country, you're an enemy and they don't want to deal with you at all. If you're a green country, you're in the security fold and notionally they'll be nicer to you. And then if you're a yellow country, you sort of, everything's going to be negotiated on a case-by-case basis type of thing. Notionally, we thought we were a green country, but one would have thought Canada and Mexico were green countries too. And Trump is busy clobbering them. So the whole theory that if you do the right thing and you play nice, that the Trump administration will treat you well, I think it's a flawed theory. I just don't think it works that way this time round. And I think Trump thinks he's got sufficient clout that he can do whatever he wants and others will fall in line. And that if they don't fall in line, he'll just put even bigger tariffs on them.
It certainly seems that this time around, the Trump administration is much more serious about a lot of things in their agenda, but including around tariffs, of course, both in wanting to impose them and without exemptions, so that hence Australia doesn't get them, but also in prosecuting them, the implementation through whatever means necessary. So that brings us to this reciprocal tariffs idea. But it goes really far, right? The reciprocal tariffs. It's not just the case that Trump is saying, for a long time, that's what he mostly talked about. He talked about how certain countries had higher tariffs on certain products, and he would cherry pick certain things and sort of say, well, that's one where they have a higher tariff and that's not fair. But now actually, the way they've construed the reciprocal tariff strategy is one which is not just about tariffs. It's about basically any policies and regulations that they think is unfair towards the United States in some way. And when it comes to Australia, I mean, it's a broader sort of question, but I think Australia is an interesting case nonetheless. There's some issues around our biosecurity rules. There's some issues around, as you mentioned, subsidies to the aluminium sector. But then there are also some really quite strange ones around treating value-added taxes, and in Australia's case, the goods and services tax, as basically a tariff. That they're going to see it that way. Issues around how Australia regulates the price of medicines through the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. So getting into health and equity sort of policies. And then also, I think this technically is under a separate thing to reciprocal tariffs, more tech-focused initiative, but nonetheless, tech-related tariffs where they take issue with how countries are trying to regulate tech platforms. So for in Australia, there's a ban on social media for children under 16 years, e-safety regulations, the media bargaining incentive, these things. What's your reaction to the Trump administration going after these things with tariffs? Is there a basis that they can point to, or is this, to me, starting to look like a lot of bleeding into an infringement of other countries' sovereignty?
I think, and I called it out as potential infringing on sovereignty some time ago, it's certainly not WTO compliant, right? It actually breaks the rules of the free trade agreement that we have, the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement, which I think consensus has. The Productivity Commission did a review of bilateral and regional trade agreements. It was a big minus for Australia, and I think that's probably true. Most of the gains that were modelled actually came from a reduction in the risk premium, and I don't think that trade agreement had really had much impact on the risk premium whatsoever. And we never really got the concessions on sugar. We got beef quotas, so we did get more beef into the market. So we also made some pretty significant concessions on the PBS. So we actually, we allow copyright to be extended for another 70 years on everything. And so we actually were very generous to the United States. And so I can see that Trump doesn't take that into account. And the PBS one is particularly a thorn in their sides because Obamacare did do some negotiations when they brought the Affordable Care Act in, and so they did start to negotiate with drug companies. Drug companies did not like it at all. Australia was held up as a model of a way to do this and use your monopoly buying power. Certainly there's a big group of companies, US companies in pharmaceuticals, who would love to see the end of the Australian pharmaceuticals system. But that really is pushing into our sovereignty, violates the trade agreement, but they're busy violating that anyway with the tariffs that they've put in place. But it also violates WTO rules. And so I think that this is where you've got to work out where your lines are going to be. Where are the line going to be crossed? Where we just go, we don't care what you throw at us. We're not changing our policies on those things. And I think ultimately that's what we've got to do. The value-added tax one, they had that massive debate in the WTO years ago when countries moved to goods and services or value-added taxes. And it made it really clear that that tax is not differentially imposed on imports, which is what a tariff is a tax on imports. It's a tax on everything that people consume. It's what it is. So it's about taxing consumption in a country, not taxing production in a country. And that's what the value-added tax is all about.
Right. And just quickly for our listeners, you mentioned the PBS there, and that's, of course, in reference to the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. Yeah, I think your point about going back to the sort of sovereignty issue is that these are significant things that countries can't be giving in on. Interestingly enough, I think, maybe for Australia, the stakes won't necessarily be that high anyway. The US exports to the US are less than 5% of Australia's exports, so not that big. Some of the newspaper reports are saying that the reciprocal tariffs might be somewhere in the range of 3 to 8% tariffs for Australia. So, maybe that will help us in standing firm on those things. That brings us to the question of what do countries do in response? I want to bring you to the retaliation question first, right? That's what people naturally go to. Economists will call that self-harm, but it's a strategic situation. Australia's not going with retaliation, but Europe, China, Canada, they have. How do you think about the retaliation question, Jenny?
Well, I think retaliation only makes sense if you can actually make somebody hurt who has sufficient clout with the US government, with the Republicans and with the administration to sort of say, hey, can we tone down this because this is hurting us? So unfortunately, Australia has pretty no clout. So if we put retaliatory tariffs on our imports, well, what are we going to do? We're going to pay more for aeroplane parts. Qantas is currently desperate to get those aeroplane parts in, and I don't think all they'll do is ramp up fares even more if they say we had to pay a tariff on aeroplane parts. I don't think anybody would be happy about that one. So if we actually look at what we import, most of it, Australians would pay the cost. So there's no point us doing it. But if you're a country that has some market power, some real sort of US is dependent on something, then you can impose more pain on them. So China was very clever last time around in targeting soybeans. And in fact, we know that the vast majority, a number I've heard is 90%, but I haven't seen the calculations that did it, but 90% or around there of the tariff revenue went to compensating US farmers. They hardly made a lot of money, but Trump's constituent is those red states. And so compensating the farmers was really important. So if you've got something that you can hurt a constituency of, the Republican Party and of business that gets in the ear of the administration, then you've got some leverage that you might actually get some action. So that's when retaliation works. It's when you actually have some market power.
So then that brings us to the really interesting question then, Jenny, is what do countries like Australia, and there are many other countries, of course, that don't have so much of this kind of market power to retaliate, but also others. I mean, what's the right response in your opinion?
Well, I think we do what we did last time when China put sanctions on us. It's a kind of a reverse situation. They blocked us out of their market by effectively whacking massive import tariffs on our products for some of them, and some of them just banning them entirely. We diversified. We looked for alternative markets. And so the US is a big market. And if other countries don't want to sell to the US, maybe they'll sell to us. And if we don't want to sell to the US, maybe we can sell to them. And so what you'll see is this big reorientation of trade away from the US markets. That'll take time because producers have to adjust. The fact that Biden didn't take down most of the Trump tariffs, or a lot of them. He did on steel and aluminium, but he didn't take down the tariffs on China. He raised some of them on electric vehicles. 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles was imposed by Biden, not Trump. And so there's a sense that the US isn't going to, even if the Trump presidency, even if you get a change of administration in 4 years' time or 3.5 years' time, it's unlikely to see a really big shift away from this current stance. The US has sold itself a rhetoric that the rest of the world has hurt it and that the rest of the world is ripping it off. It sees its budget, its current account deficit as a signature that the rest of the world is ripping it off, not as a signature that it's been able to borrow really cheaply from the rest of the world because it's the United States and it's in US dollars, and that allowed them to fund their deficit spending at a far lower cost than any other country could have ever done. They don't see that, right? And so they've convinced themselves that trade has been really unfair to the United States. That's really unfortunate because it means that even with a change of administration, it may take quite some time before the US shifts. So what you're going to see is every other country is looking around going, how do we keep international trade going? If you're a developing country, you really want international trade. They know that that's their answer to foreign investment, to knowledge transfer, to getting scale and efficiency, and to economic growth. For Australia, we really want to see other countries do well because ultimately it's still the price of our commodities that we export that gives us our prosperity and drives our prosperity. So we want the rest of the world to be prosperous. So we've got a vested interest in that. China has a vested interest because, yes, it's big. Yes, it runs a trade surplus, but it runs a food and fuel deficit. So it needs trade because even if its population is shrinking, it still needs a lot of imports of food and fuel to do well. And it wants to keep international trade going, even as it grows its domestic consumption. Though we all wish it would have started doing that a little sooner and a little more actively than spending way too much money on infrastructure. And then now promoting exports, so selling us better quality, cheaper stuff, which is all very nice, but it's not rebalancing the global economy. And so China now has responsibility to rebalance if it wants to see other countries really take advantage of, well, we can exclude the US, but there's a lot else going on there. And so we can find a lot of comparative advantage in the rest of the world, excluding the US. And sometimes not having the US in there with its rules and its requirements and will actually potentially facilitate trade and make it a bit easier. Who knows? I'd like to believe that.
Well, I think that's a nice sort of thought, that staying open is the best kind of retaliation. It's sort of like saying the best revenge is a life well lived. That has a nice sort of ring to it. I mean, it will be difficult. I think we've talked about it before, though, that with all the exports being deflected around the world away from the United States, the knee-jerk reaction could be to respond, other countries responding with additional protectionist measures. So let's hope that doesn't occur, and it will take a lot of leadership and active diplomacy, really, from politicians and governments. So let's hope they're up to the task. Jenny, I think that's a good point to leave it on, with that sort of what the agenda should look like going forward. So let me thank you for sharing your thoughts on a really complex, fast-moving issue of Trump and his tariffs. That story is not going away, so we possibly will have to have you again sometime soon on the podcast. But thank you very much, Jenny.
Thanks so much, Roland. Enjoyed talking to you.
You've been listening to Development Futures, a podcast from the Indo-Pacific Development Centre at the Lowy Institute, hosted by Institute experts and supported by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, with today's episode produced by Darcy Milne. Development Futures is part of the Lowy Institute podcast network. Find all of our podcast series on our website, lowyinstitute.org/publications. Thanks for listening.